Thank you very much, Elif, for this very generous introduction. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to Aretz, to Elif, and to Charles Gates specifically for inviting me to give this talk. And I have not spoken about Polatlı in this depth or detail for a couple of years now. And there's been new material coming in. So it's also very exciting for me to be able to share all of this with you. So my talk today is will focus on the Bronze Age of Western Ankara and most dominantly the district of Polatlı, where I've been directing an archaeological survey since 2019. The key geographical focus of our survey region is the part of Sakarya Basin right here, the Sakarya River right here, where it traces part of the border between Ankara and Eskişehir. This region has strong links to Anatolia's multiple historical horizons, the last one being the Battle of Sakarya in 1921, a decisive moment in the Turkish War of Independence. Mirroring this 20th century encounter between different forces, Polatlı continuously sat on the margins during the Bronze Age, but what sitting on the margin meant changed from period to period. In the early Bronze Age, for example, the 3rd millennium BCE, Polatlı was located along the northern border of the spread of the EBA citadel culture, the early Bronze Age citadel culture. And you can see our region marked with a purple rectangular here. So we have a lot to talk about in terms of material culture of this early Bronze Age network, and I will be delving into this for a bulk of my talk today. The intensification of trade with northern Mesopotamia in the Middle Bronze Age crystallized in an exchange network connecting the central plateau with mainly northern Syria. This was a network dotted by trade posts bringing together Anatolian and Assyrian merchants, and Polatlı was at the northwestern sort of edge of it. So you see there is the network is not shown to be extending to north. And of course, the question always is this evidence of absence or absence of evidence? But I will come back to this later. This non-central location in terms of not being at the very heart of the network, such as in Kanesh or in other parts of the plateau, however, did not mean isolation. In his study of Middle Bronze Age trade networks, Gojko Baryamovich suggested that the path to the Sakarya River was very high quality, could handle traffic with wagons, and it was one of the very active, dynamic participants in this trade network. Cities around this, along this route, were big consumers of quote-unquote foreign material culture. Textual and archaeological evidence from the late Bronze Age situate this region to be peripheral to the Hittite Empire. The core of the empire firmly sat within the bend of the Kızılırmak River. Here, if you can see my cursor, centered around the capital city of Hattusha, right here. Archives from this core region produce few references to Sakarya, the Hittite Sehiriya or Sahariya, and one significant example comes from the extensive annals of Mursili II, where the king mentions encountering a celestial phenomenon, a gis kalmishna, manifested by the storm god when Mursili reached the river. Translated variedly as a thunderbolt, a meteor, or a comet, this phenomenon can be read as the storm god's support or warning as the Hittite king is crossing the rivers towards the west, towards where he says, Mursili says he's facing. While I specifically chose this textual example and this map of the Hittite Empire by Meltem and Metin Alparslan that very clearly sees a border right here in our survey region. So this is where they situate the line between Hapala and Hatti by the Sakarya, traced by the Sakarya River. I also want to say that I am not taking the presence of a border here for granted. Instead, I am using it as a starting point to evaluate the archaeological evidence from the region, both collected by us through the Polatlı survey and as reported by other studies. In archaeological literature to date, the northern portion of the eastern border zone around where we are gives the impression of a sparsely populated and loosely connected region when compared with the imperial center within the bend of the Kızılırmak River. For example, in 2011, Jürgen Zeher suggested that, and I quote, this northern part of the western inner Anatolia was a backwater during most of the late Bronze Age, end of quote. So what can we say about the representative nature of this data? In other words, is this reading an accurate representation mainly of the archaeological record itself, Or does this point to a state of archaeological research, publication, and site preservation along the empire's western frontier? To start answering this question, allow me to offer a brief overview of the archaeological fieldwork undertaken in Polatlı debates. Ankara's ascension to the status of the newly minted capital of the Republic in 1923 triggered a set of state-sponsored archaeological excavations around the province. Van der Oosten's excavations in Gevur Kalesi started in 1930 and were followed by work by Turkish archaeologists, the earliest example of which was the excavations in Ahlatlıbel by Hamit Zübeyir Koşar in 1933. Following short spurts of work in Etiyokuşu, Karaoğlan, and Ergazi through the 1930s, there was a halt until the late 1940s, which can in no doubt be explained by World War II. But what happened was, since the early years of the Republic was so invested in Ankara, I think we somehow got the impression that we know Ankara's archaeology. We have done a lot of work, so now it's time to look at other places. So I will say that except for mainly Gordian, this region was not then come back to at a very intensive way until quite recently. Undoubtedly, the key site in the region is the Phrygian capital at Gordian, which has been under continuous excavation by teams from the University of Pennsylvania since 1950, and currently under the direction of Brian Rose. Second millennium BCE settlement contexts were excavated on the city mound in the area known as the North Trench in the 1950s, where late Bronze Age materials preceded the early Phrygian without a break. A second millennium BC cemetery was excavated in the northeastern ridge until tumuli H and I, and this white arrow points to that. And Mahdalt Milling published it as the quote-unquote Hittite cemetery at Gordian, while problematizing the use of the term Hittite to denote linguistic or political types, as the material from the Gordian cemetery could not be proven to reach into the imperial period. It is now generally accepted that these graves date earlier in the second millennium BCE, probably to the current period. So the Hittite cemetery, quote unquote, at Gordian might be, after all, a misnomer. But there's also recent evaluations of the late Bronze Age levels in ceramics in Gordian, so I will come back to those later when I'm discussing our own ceramic data. The Gordian team also undertook a regional survey, the Gordian Regional Survey, directed by Lisa Kielhofer between 1996 and 2001. The team worked in 9 transects in the close vicinity of Gordian, marked here on the map, and located a significant decrease in the number of sites between the Middle and the Late Bronze Ages, which was coupled with an increase in site size in Late Bronze Age Gordian. Taken together, this has been interpreted as, I quote, urban consolidation and/or regional outmigration. However, the survey team also noted that the small number of late Bronze Age sites found in the vicinity of Gordian can be at least partially related to the large-scale Phrygian intervention in the landscape, where they were moving massive quantities of soil, as well as processes of alluviation and erosion, all of which could signify significantly displace or bury archaeological materials. Another significant site of the region is Hacı Tuğrul Höyük, also known in the literature as Kara Höyük, Tuğrul Höyük, or Yeni Doğan Höyük. It's a mound with many names. And it was excavated by Burhan Tezcan from the Anatolian Civilizations Museum between 1972 and 1979. The marks left by these early excavations are still clearly visible from aerial photography. The site is one of the best places to check out this satellite imagery, which I somehow did not put in, although I speak about it. So that's going to be one of the nazar boncuğu of this presentation. Between 2007 and 2001, the Japanese Institute of Anatolian Archaeology conducted archaeological as well as magnetic survey on the site under the direction of Yamashita. The Japanese team dated the occupation of the site to the early Iron Age, from the early Iron Age to the end of the late Phrygian sequence in the 4th century, consistent with earlier findings. Excavations on this mound have recently been renewed under the direction of Bahattin Çelik from Ankara Yıldırım Beyazıt University. Another important site is Polatlı Höyük, a high mound currently mostly overtaken by the dense city center of Polatlı. And you can see even between 1971 and now, last year, from the satellite imagery, you can see it continues to be eaten into. although it's now currently surrounded by walls. So I'm hoping this means there will be no more urbanization on the mount. British Institute at Ankara conducted one season of excavation here under the direction of Seton Lloyd and Nuri Gökçe in 1949. They had £100 left over in their budget for the year, so they decided to do an excavation with that amount of money, which lasted them for 18 days of fieldwork with around 50 workmen, so something about ancient economy. So during these 18 days of fieldwork, they were able to unearth 31 occupational layers spanning the entire Bronze Age. From these levels, 23rd to 31st were dubbed as Hittite and were dated to the Late Bronze Age. The ceramic evidence collected from this short season demonstrated a high level of continuity through the Bronze Age in terms of both shape and fabric. So I have this table here, which is, I know, not very legible, but it's, I think, enough for the overall picture. So here you have all the Bronze Age forms that they were identifying, all the types. And here you have this linear progression of time from earlier to later. So the one thing that we can see from here is this very gradual trickling of some of the forms of the early Bronze Age into the late Bronze Age, and then some things appearing just directly at the end of the sequence. Whereas there is this 1/3 pretty much of the sequence in which we have either early Bronze or Middle Bronze forms continuing directly into the late Bronze Age. So it's a gradual and reasonably continuous sequence. A couple of regional survey projects with scopes ranging to multiple provinces also conducted work in Polatlı. The Central Anatolian Survey of the Japanese Institute of Anatolian Archaeology covered 9 provinces in Central Anatolia under the direction of Dr. Omura between 1986 and 2007. Their major focus was the Iron Age, as the Japanese team was firstly occupied with understanding the regional context of Karapınar Höyük. In 1994, the team worked in Polatlı, recording a total of 10 sites that are currently within the administrative limits of the city. And we have visited, I think, pretty much all of these sites so far in our survey. And another project was a survey of Galatian citadels and settlements carried out by a team led by Levent Vardar between 1996 and 2006, but they understandably did not report any Bronze Age sites in their data. There's also an important tradition of museum excavations in this region that I'm not including here now, as they remain mostly unpublished, but we have evidence from those as well if one looks for it. So in sum, for this previous work, Polatlı has been home to only a few regional archaeological investigations, while Gordion is very important for anchoring us, as well as Polatlı Höyük. When we are looking at the entire region of Polatlı, we don't have that much to go on, especially for the Bronze Age evidence. And the evidence so far suggests that there is a decline in settlement numbers through the 2nd millennium BCE. So there was, when we were starting to think about this region, starting a survey, there was a very clear gap in the Bronze Age that we were concerned with. So I launched Polatlı Landscape Archaeology and Survey Project, or as we very lovingly call it, PLAS, with a specific focus on addressing the gap of research on the Bronze Age of the region. Following a short pilot season in 2019 and a pause because of the COVID pandemic in 2020, we had 3 successful field seasons between 21 and 23, followed by a study season in 2024. PLAS is an intensive regional survey that aims to explore the borderland processes and the archaeological signatures of the Hittite Empire in its western frontier by using Polatlı as a case study, as well as tracing the lines of evidence for the local response to imperialism, if we can find it. It employs a diachronic view to understand Hittite imperialism, meaning that we focus on the entirety of the Bronze Age to explore continuity and change with the coming of the Hittite power. PLAS employs a combination of regional and site-based survey techniques to systematically sample and explore the landscapes in Polatlı. We work on the different geographic features in the survey region, such as alluvial plains, highlands, and the riverscapes and valleys defined by the Sakarya River and its tributaries. Our field walking is based on what we call a survey unit. This can be a discrete field, a piece of land that's very easily defined in the field while we are doing the field work itself. And what we do is when we establish a survey unit, our team members walk transects 10 meters apart, and they count all the archaeological materials encountered within 2 meters of their transect. So 1 meter to the left and 1 to the right. So we have a 20% coverage overall. And then for each SU, we do detailed documentation of our collection strategy, land cover, field status, soil characteristics, soil color, contemporary structures, along with photographs and sketches. The peripheries of survey units are then recorded with handheld GPS units, as well as points marking change in the distribution patterns of objects. So if we see an increase or a decrease in the density of surface finds, we take points to make sure we can then come back to the lab, and from those survey units with their detailed documentation in the lab, we can reconstruct on our GIS database the edges of the sites. So while we work on survey units as our main units in fieldwork, then when we are processing this material back in the lab, we start defining these sites on the basis of distribution. Select Bronze Age settlements discovered through this are then more intensively surveyed through a site-based method. In 2019 and 21, we used the Dalglish method to achieve 100% coverage in select survey units placed regularly on grids. So we use this in Hacı Tuğrul and Karapınar Höyük. For this, we throw a grid on the site, and then the team members navigate to the coordinates determined by the grid, put in a stake with a 5-meter rope attached to it, and walked in a concentric line, hence the name Dalglish. And they are walking 1 meter apart and collecting all the archaeological materials within the 10-meter diameter circle. So we're achieving 100% coverage here. In 2022, we switched to a different total coverage method in which we walk transects 2 meters apart, amounting to 100% coverage. We use this only at Sarıoba, but we marked each transect as a different SU, which then gave us a chance to distinguish density and change throughout the site. So when I say we collect all the materials, I have to clarify this. We collect all the materials in the field, but then we look through them, and then we keep only diagnostics while keeping a record of what we discard back at the site. So we do a total collection followed by a very preliminary analysis in the site that separates diagnostics from non-diagnostics, and then non-diagnostics are discarded back at the site. And then the diagnostics are taken to our survey lab at Bilkent University for detailed analysis and reporting. So covering more than 3,500 kilometers squares, Polatlı poses a challenge to the surveyor in terms of coverage. It has always been clear that we would never be able to walk systematically this entire region over 4 seasons. So instead, we used the tried and true method of sampling and worked on the highlands, alluvial plains, and riverscapes in each season. It is the river valleys that define the landscapes of Polatlı, as much as the hills and the highlands they cut through. The Çilada Massif on the north here act as a major separator, while its western and eastern flanks enabled movements in the past as in the present. A ring of hills and mountains enclose the modern city center of Polatlı, such as Çalda and Yıldızlı Dağ to the immediate south here. Cut from the massive Siriusar mountain ranges to the west, where you cannot see, and they are cut off here by the Sakarya River. Going east-northeast, we have a series of hills forming highlands in an industrial landscape of various scales of production today. So this is mainly this region. And this area so far bore a limited evidence of archaeological occupation, not entirely empty, obviously, but not as sometimes as densely populated as well. Towards the south, Ilıca Özü River right here opens up a major corridor of mobility and agricultural production and divides into multiple tributaries going east, including Hamamözü, İncesu, and Katrançayı. Throughout our 4 field seasons, we have discovered and worked on more than 45 archaeological sites dating to the Chalcolithic through the Ottoman period. Within this vast area for an archaeological survey, we privileged maximizing what we can learn from a limited area over more sparse coverage over the entire region. This is why the southern portion of Polatlı remains glaringly empty on our site maps. As you can see here, we have a lot of work to do here. The only exception here is the site of Ilıca Höyük, its necropolis, and an associated rock-cut tomb chamber. And this was because wherever we went in Polatlı and told we're archaeologists, everybody told us we have to go see Ilıca. So we finally did. We took a day off to take that trip, and it was worth it. It's a beautiful Roman mound with a stela and inscription and an associated necropolis with multiple stelae dating mainly to the Roman period. So we are hopeful for an extension of 1 year in our permit for this year due to some changes in the circumstances, and the southern region will be our top priority for 2025. However, for the rest of this talk, I'll focus on the central and the northern zones of Polatlı that you see here with many of our sites marked on the map. Our fieldwork to date located a variety of settlements, most of which fall under one of the three site categories. Mounded sites, often representing multiple time periods, such as Hacı Tuğrul Höyük on the screen, and this will be the type of site you will hear most often in this talk today. Then we have citadels on hilltops, most of which date to the Hellenistic, Roman, and medieval periods, and thus outside of the main period of interest for this paper. But I'm giving you one example, Kargalı Kalesi, and we have this ring of fortresses that were intervisible from each other in this region. And then finally, we have flat sites that can represent either a single or multiple period of occupation, but they're not as densely occupied or as long of a time period to end up in mounds such as Hacı Tuğrul, and they are not defined on natural hills as well. So the landscapes of Polatlı enable a dominantly east-west connection. The corridors of mobility defined by the river valleys and depressions connect in today's world, Temelli in the east with Sivrihisar in the west much more easily than, say, Yunak in the south to Ayaş in the north. These north-south allegiances are visible clearly, but partially in only two instances. The first is the northern segment right here, this line that you see, which hugs around the skirts of the Çileda, and this route serves as the Polatlı-Ayaş road today. The second is the southern portion here with multiple corridors of continuity that is oriented towards the northwest of Konya, especially to Yunak, Akşehir, and Ilgın. While the southern world will constitute our focus going forward in fieldwork, we were able to explore the north so far. So evaluating our data set within this geographical context made three clusters of settlements visible. This northern cluster is aligned quite beautifully with the central corridor connecting Polatlı and Ayaş, and as I said, this is still the major road connecting these two settlements today. With settlements situated on either side of this road, this actually emphasizes the importance of this connection through time. A second cluster emerges between the Çileda and the central highlands, a more internally defined landscape that has Hacı Tuğrul Höyük at its center. The southern cluster stretches linearly over here, again between highlands, and offers a rich landscape of ancient settlements. Now let's focus on the Bronze Age and go through the 3rd and the 2nd millennium BCE in more detail. Before I start this portion, let me say that our material analysis is still not complete, as we had just one full study season. So please regard these as preliminary results and let me know if your questions and comments in the Q&A. And I see a lot of people who have done work on this region, so I'm very excited to hear from you about this. So in our data set so far, 15 sites contain early Bronze Age materials, making it the best represented period in the entire survey region. This view matches the narrative emerging from the literature on early Bronze Age Anatolia, in which we see this drive for urbanization through the Central Plateau. Especially the second half of the 3rd millennium BCE was the period when regional centers with limited control over their hinterlands emerged in high numbers across Anatolia in a process of centralization. One of our key sites for the early Bronze Age is Karapınar Höyük, a mound sitting on the eastern edge of Polatlı. The Anatolian Civilizations Museum in Ankara undertook excavations in this mound in the 1960s under the leadership of Raci Temizler. And this research ended up yielding a number of figurines dating to the early bronze that demonstrate parallels with other third millennium sites in the region. Four figurines in total were found in a variety of contexts, including storage, burial, and domestic. The first example on the left here has parallels with the Büyük Menderes region, particularly the violin-shaped figurines from Beyce Sultan, so this one right here. With further distribution towards the south and southwest towards Afyon and Denizli, this idol has affinities in a large geography. Halil Hamdi Ekiz, who studied these figurines together with the excavated examples from Etiyokuşu, suggested a dating of early Bronze Age 2 and 3, roughly the second half of the 3rd millennium BCE. Illicit digging is a problem for our entire survey region, but Karayavşan was unfortunately one of the worst examples of this that we have encountered so far. When we arrived at the site on the morning of June 25th, 2022, we were greeted by a very freshly opened section that you can see on the photograph, actually, this darker area, and this entire section was just very recently excavated. We were told that this happened as a result of taking soil from the mound regularly, because this is one of the areas that the local community uses for their mud brick production. And later that day, our conversations with the locals demonstrated to us that the mound is now much lower than what it used to be. They have these memories of going on top of the mound as teenagers and watching the sunset. So this used to be a very high place in the landscape, acting as a landmark. This might be one reason for the predominantly early material we found at the site, such as these vessels dating to the 3rd millennium BCE. We encountered a limited number of Hellenistic and Roman period sherds at the very top of this section, which was the highest preserved point on the mound, which might work to prove this. So maybe we are lacking a significant amount of the later material. The intense destruction of the site cutting into settlement contexts provided us with some complete or almost complete vessels, which never happens in survey, at least to me. And this juglet and the shallow hemispherical bowl were examples of this. So if we are to locate the material culture from Karayavşan and other early Bronze Age sites in Polatlı for us, we have to look at larger networks starting from the west. So Turanefe and Deniz Sarı identified Polatlı as part of the Upper Sakarya Basin in certain points of the early Bronze Age. So for example, their definitions of the material for EVA 1A, the very beginning, have some overlap with the forms, especially the loop-handled bowls, which start at the very beginning, but then increase in numbers during EVA 1B. So some of the defining factors of this group are bright red, slip and burnish, high degree of chaff inclusions visible on the surface, and oval sections for the loop handles, which is also what we have in our material. But we are also partially at home in the Büyük Menderes Yukarı Porsuk region as well. You see some examples here from Karayavşan, 2 loop handle bowls, and then 1 juglet. And then you can also see on the right top some figurines from the Büyük Menderes Yukarı Porsuk region that resembles the first figurine that I was showing you from Karayavşan. However, of course, we have very good comparisons for our material from the rest of Ankara, specifically the sites of Ahlatlıbel and Çayyolu Höyük. And here we seem to have a lot of overlap for these shallow bowls with loop handles that can be either smaller. We have multiple examples of this kind. We also have these larger handles that go pretty much almost through the body, and then multiple examples of, again, jugs and juglets and different bowls. Another amazing find from Karayavşan was this almost complete melting pot with metal stacks still preserved inside, which was taken by the Anatolian Civilizations Museum as an inventory item. This vessel is an excellent example of the significance of metal ores and metalworking in the emergence of these regional centers. As the name suggests, it will be used to melt the metal inside, and to maximize heat resistance capacity, these vessels had very thick walls and a coarse fabric that contained a large quantity of large-sized inclusion. So in our survey region, many early Bronze Age sites produced evidence of metalworking, including these melting pots and metal stacks, an index of metalworking and production at a site. An important site in this regard is Köroğlu Kayalıkları in the village of Türkkarsak, a single period settlement located on the slopes of Yıldızlar by the Yarözü Deresi. The ceramic material yielded from the site dates exclusively to the late Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age transition and the early Bronze Age proper. Among the finds was another well-preserved melting pot along with metal slags spread all over the site, and I'm showing you only some examples here. The site's abandonment after the early Bronze Age may suggest that we are dealing with a production site whose vitality depended on the ability to acquire the raw material, which is not abundant naturally in this region itself. So it would need to be coming from long-term, long-distance networks. And these networks might have shifted with the end of the early Bronze Age, leading to the abandonment of this site. The end of the early Bronze Age was a time of large-scale destruction observed across Anatolian plateau. In Polatlı, site numbers dropped to 10 in Middle Bronze Age from our survey material, amounting to abandonment of 1/3 of third millennium sites. Interestingly, however, all Middle Bronze Age sites we worked on so far have previous early Bronze levels, so we are yet to identify any Middle Bronze Age new foundations in our region. So we seem to have a strong continuity in occupation in that sense. And then we have a similarly 10 sites that date to the survey, that date to the late Bronze Age in our survey area. So while here the numbers are the same, there is slight discontinuity in the data set. 3 Middle Bronze Age sites gets abandoned. These are Karatepe, Gündoğan, and Karayavşan, while there are 3 new foundations, Beyceğiz, Hıdırşehir, and possibly Hacı Tuğrul. And here I'm saying possibly because from our survey material, I think we have late Bronze Age materials specifically onto splash rim bowls, but since the excavations are now renewed under Bahattin Çelik, I am waiting to see their data to make this claim more forcefully. I will now move on to material from 2 key sites for our second millennium BCE. First is Karapınar Höyük, my opening picture, a low mount that produced high numbers of extremely well-burnished, high-quality Middle Bronze Age wares, in addition to the plain vessels of the Late Bronze Age, which we Hittite scholars lovingly call drabware or monochrome ware. Only 3rd and 2nd millennium BCE materials are present on Karapınar, which made it a great candidate for us to undertake site-based survey. We thought that if we look at this in detail, we might be able to see the differences in the waxing and veining of the area of occupation through the Bronze Age. But our first attempt in 2021 was a failed attempt. We did not see anything. Once we stepped foot outside of this mount proper, we honestly didn't see anything. And just a little bit of a walking around just made us realize that there's a huge fill over this area because of the railroad construction that just happened exactly by this mound. So they were just dumping huge amounts of soil around. So understanding that we will not be able to find anything in the larger context, we did a site-based survey just focusing on the mound proper as it is preserved today in 2022. We used a much smaller grid, and we once again yielded only 3rd and 2nd millennium BCE material. So I am confident in saying that this doesn't have anything earlier or later. Our second key site for the 2nd millennium is the beautiful site of Sarıoba Höyük, standing just 300 meters away from the Ankara Çayı at the very northern edge of Polatlı. And if I'm ever persuaded to excavate one day, I would love it to be for Sarıoba, because this is, in terms of its landscape context, in terms of its material, this was a really interesting site. So contrary to Karapınar Höyük, Sarıoba demonstrates uninterrupted occupation from the Chalcolithic to the end of the Roman period. In 2022, we tried the experimental site-based survey on this method, where we just walked 2 meters apart and did a really deep dive on the site itself. Our results indicate that a small Chalcolithic settlement is encountered only in the center of the mound. And this is followed by an extensive early Bronze Age site. So when we come to the 3rd millennium, the site just truly blossoms. And it continues to retain its large size during the 2nd millennium BCE. We have encountered materials dating to early, middle, and late Bronze Age in every single survey unit on this mound and its close vicinity, suggesting that the Bronze Age was the heyday for Sarıoba Höyük. This is followed by a limited Iron Age settlement, which expands during the Hellenistic period, but it never comes back to the degree of the Bronze Age settlement at the site. One of the most common pottery forms for the Middle Bronze Age are the so-called bead rim bowls, both in Sarıoba but also in our larger survey region. Fashioned after metal vessels dating to the early Bronze Age, the bead rim bowls are almost exclusively closed vessels with sharp carnations. These vessels become the characteristic shape of inner Western Anatolia during this period, and then appear in multiple significant regional centers, such as Beyce Sultan. As the bead rim bowls did not continue into the late Bronze Age in the same way with the same kind of burnish and surface treatment, this type of vessel is also a convenient marker for dating the very end of the early Bronze Age, but then specifically the Middle Bronze Age. For the late Bronze Age, we have a varied corpus from which I will highlight just a few types in the interest of time. On the top are two examples of cooking pots which are manufactured out of local clays, and both their local production and their shapes compare well to the examples we know from many sites on the plateau. On the bottom is a large pot. Unfortunately, these surfaced on the interior, but this is a T8 in Müller-Karpis typology, which is, in other words, a large pot which was specifically related to beer brewing. They replace an earlier type of large pot used for the same purpose, and they seem to mark a later date through the sequence in the late Bronze Age. So we have, in other words, evidence, and I'm again showing you just a few examples for food preparation and cooking pots and beer brewing vessels that compare very well to the Hittite core region. We also have a large variety of anti-splash rim bowls, and İpek Kürömeroğlu, a master's student in Bilkent archaeology, is working on these vessels as part of her thesis. So these are vessels that are strengthened on the interior and they really become very prominent during the Bronze Age, during the late Bronze Age, sorry. These bowls also form the majority of the overall Hittite ceramic repertoire in many sites, so they are very prevalent and very common. They were most likely used for serving food and drinks, since they are not matched by similar numbers in drinking vessels. So we are thinking that the smaller examples could also be used for drinking, while the larger examples could be used for eating more distinctly. I mean, one would hope. We also have baking plates, a technology, a form of ceramics that is very clearly late Bronze Age. So this is a new introduction to the Bronze Age sequence on the Central Plateau with the late Bronze Age, with the coming of the Hittites. So these are very large vessels, and the examples in Hattusha come as big as 80 centimeters in diameter, whereas in Gordian, we have examples that go up to 60 centimeters. And they are made of local clay, mostly handmade, because they are very huge and very thick. And again, they are built for temperature resistance. They are made to be able to stay on the fire. And one of the uses, we think, was to do these kind of pide or tandır kind yufka type of breads. But at the same time, we have examples found in situ in which these plates were used as what's the word for this in English? As bases for like smaller ovens, so they could be used to insulate the heat for the oven. And this is interesting and an exciting find because before the finds in Gordian and what we were able to find, we did not have examples of the baking plates so much in the western frontier of the empire. So it is very interesting that both Gordian and us have these in our assemblages. So now let me zoom out a little bit and from our region go specifically to Gordian and talk about the late Bronze Age sequences there in more detail. So as I said, the Gordian excavations previously were able to locate and study the ceramic repertoire. So, and Gunter looked at the entire Bronze Age sequence following the publication by Mahtat Melink in the 1980s and early 1990s. And we have a modest yet very varied corpus of ceramics that were excavated. These include fineware, plates, multi-purpose pots, cooking pots, and storage vessels. Later, neutron activation analysis, a work that was done spearheaded by Lisa Kielhofer and Peter Grave, demonstrated that the ceramic production at the site was almost exclusively local and made use of clay beds along the Sakarya River. The forms and production techniques, however, show overlap with the Hittite heartland within the bend of the Kızılırmak River, suggesting that Gordian was enfolded within the larger Hittite economic and productive system, and yet it was doing its local production. Some of the earlier studies suggested that every late Bronze Age vessel type excavated in Gordian is known from Hattusha, while Hattusha's assemblage has specimens not encountered at Gordian. Stamp seal impressions preserved on a few vessels suggest administrative links with the Hittite Empire, although the evidence is not enough to distinguish between a local administrator versus a Hittite official located at the site. As a result, Gordian demonstrates a multi-scalar interaction with the Hittite imperial center and likely functioned as a border town that was enfolded within the imperial network. And the control of this was beneficial for the empire, since Gordian was and is located on a very crucial crossing over the Sakarya. So from these assemblages and also the larger repertoire that I did not have time to go into detail today, it's possible to draw conclusions regarding scholarship, material connections, and also continuity. First, while the earlier scholarship on Gordian's Bronze Age saw a more modest and conservative settlement here, the recent scholarship, equipped with archaeometric analysis, revisiting the assemblage, has started painting a stronger portrait of Gordian for the Late Bronze. The same is true for the region at large, where we were able to witness a variety of Late Bronze Age material forms that both overlap with the Hittite core region while continuing to use local fabrics. Second, our fieldwork data from PLAS so far does not represent a significant decrease in site numbers that have been reported before. Maybe be as bold to suggest that the late Bronze Age in Polatlı might not be as elusive as textual and previous archaeological literature led us to believe. While it is not easy for me to provide a conclusive answer to this yet, we can paint a broad picture. The Sakarya Basin, I think, was clearly within the Hittite sphere of control and suffered from imperial interventions, such as settlement relocation, new foundations. So abandoned sites and late Bronze Age new foundations can be read as part of the empire's strategy to govern the frontier through unsettling long-term settlement continuity, to redistribute access to productive land and resources. However, continuity also exists between the Middle Bronze and the Late Bronze. 70% of our sites continue to the Late Bronze Age, while the ceramic repertoire of Gordian and Polatlı demonstrates continuity from previous periods. These trends can be interpreted as Sakarya Basin being a complex borderland, a world that was both under Hittite influence and yet partially continuing its previous Bronze Age practices. So I want to, while I'm moving towards my closing here, I want to move on to some remarks about our future work and directions. So right now, there are three questions that I'm grappling with as we're going forward. And the first of these is, at least from the material we were able to collect so far and the data, do the geographical clusters I was seeing through a reading of the landscape correspond to material clusters? In other words, am I going to be able to see connected, obviously, but also peculiar types of material culture in the sites contained within these three different geographical clusters? That's one of the things I'm looking at now, specifically for the second millennium, but this is also a work that we are doing for our later Iron Age material, especially by Edado Aras. A second question, which I already talked about, is the Bronze Age of Southern Polatlı, which will require more field work, and we are going to be working on that. And then the third question is, the patterns of increase and decrease for the late Bronze Age consistent? Are those consistent through Polatlı, or are there micro-regions of centralization and dispersal? So in other words, is the reason why we see an abandonment of late Bronze Age settlements around Gordian is because Gordian was becoming a more important site and sort of like draining its hinterland from these smaller settlements? Or is this a trend that we can say for the entire larger region? And my most important current crusade right now is how do we go from this to this? And this is not in terms of the material itself or the production of the ceramics, which are obviously going to be part of the conversation. But what I am now trying to understand is how the, I think, metal-led economies and networks of the early Bronze Age connected or discontinued into the Middle Bronze Age and then became a part of the Hittite Empire. And on the other side of this conversation is, can we say how the Hittite Empire tried to control these networks of material acquisition and production technologies? In other places that I worked on before, and in my doctoral dissertation, I saw the Hittite imperial system as a very flexible apparatus, which was trying to govern its border regions through understanding what is important, how these communities understand power locally, and then trying to adapt it in ways that will enable them to govern these regions. So in Polatlı, then my current question that I'm trying to answer is, can we say these early Bronze Age networks very dominantly settled on production? Were those important for the Hittite Empire when they tried to move into the region in the following centuries? So this requires answering these questions requires mustering a lot of resources and data on a regional scale. And one of the things that we are embarked on now is to use historical satellite imagery, specifically corona images from early 1970s, to try to locate sites which we might be not able to see in the current satellite imagery. So Mali Akman is now working on this project, and we will be doing some ground truthing in the upcoming summer. So while we have these like larger regional ambitions, we are also working on zooming in on sites of key importance, both those that are occupied throughout the Bronze Age, but also those that were abandoned at some point or were new foundations. Part of our ongoing work is constructing these single site biographies through landscape and material evidence to understand the totality of the Bronze Age in Polatlı in a more nuanced manner. But it's getting more and more difficult to do these things. And I want to finish with something that I see as very fundamental to how we do archaeological fieldwork today, because we have been really feeling the impact of climate change and the Anthropocene in the Central Plateau during our field seasons. And I'm not only talking about the sometimes unbearable hot weather, which has always been part of the deal, but since the rains are now shifting, we are not able to survey in June always anymore. And sometimes with the flooding, there are total areas that we are not able to see the site distribution all that well. So I think there is a conversation there to be had about how do we continue to do field work on the Central Plateau during this age of the Anthropocene. So in closing, I want to thank all the institutions that made PLAS a possibility since 2019, both with permits and both with funding. And of course, I am most indebted to the Minister of Culture and Tourism, Kültür Varlıkları ve Müzeler Genel Müdürlüğü. But as usual, my biggest thanks are to my youthful, cheerful, and dynamic team who walks up and down with me in these fields with always a smile on their faces. And none of this research would be possible without their contributions. Thank you for listening.